In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Welcome, friends, to the 35th episode of Crime and Punishment, a legal podcast, a non-political podcast, the official podcast of the Invictus Law Firm, PA, a criminal defense law firm in Orlando, Florida, the website for which is augustusinvictus.com, and that is me, yours truly, your host. Today I will not be joined by Tiger Gin. Unfortunately, he has real work to do. So, you are just with me. We are all by our lonesomes here. Today, I want to talk with you about the detentions at Guantanamo Bay, as well as some stuff about January 6th. Non-political, purely legal. As well as the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism that was published by the Biden administration last year. So first, I want to go to YouTube and make sure that we are loud and clear, because you know, if you listen to this frequently, you know we have some technical difficulties because I'm the one doing it, and this is not my fort, as they say. So it does not appear to be working at its best, but we'll see how that goes. Let's talk about Guantanamo Bay. After I pitch, however, the newsletter and viral style, if you look at the thing there at the description, you will see the viral style. You'll see all the different social media websites and all the other stuff we broadcast on. Please do follow those. I always forget to plug that. Let's get to the articles here. The first one is from The Intercept, and the screen is blacked out. I don't understand why that's happened. Clearly government interference. Just kidding. The Intercept published an article recently, it's on January 13th, about the 20-year anniversary of Guantanamo Bay. And it will ask you when you go there, join the newsletter. Wait a minute. I'm already in the newsletter. Should have done this before going live. I had no idea I would have to sign in to this thing. No, I do not want to donate. And that's why. Because The Intercept, they still once in a while have great articles. On the other hand, they've gone so far left-wing and so pro-establishment that it really, there's a reason that Greenwald quit. Let's just leave it at that. It does not appear that the YouTube is working, so if y'all do hear this, please do let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to try to work with this thing. Computer just doesn't seem to be working at all. We're also going to read from the Proud Boys complaint, which I'm sure y'all have heard about by now, as a Charlottesville-style complaint filed against the Proud Boys for alleged liability concerning the January 6th events. Here we go. The Intercept published this article called Guantanamo Notebook, the subtitle being, I spent 20 years covering America's secretive detention regime. Torture was always the subtext. U.S. takes hooded, shackled detainees to Cuba, declared the Washington Post headline on January 11th, 2002. The reporters who wrote it were on the ground at Guantanamo Bay and in Kandahar, Afghanistan. I was in Washington. This is Margot Williams speaking. I was in Washington at my desk in the Post newsroom, where I worked as a researcher. As I read the story, the ominous revelation stuck with me. The 20 prisoners whose identities have not been made public. There are multiple issues about what happened in Guantanamo Bay. One of them, the secretive nature of it. Another, as we're going to get into in the article, the fact that it has been 20 years that some of these guys have been detained there with no trial. Allegedly, they'll be going to trial in 2023. That's kind of the, what Miss Williams is hinting at in this article, 20 years without a trial is insane. Now, there were a lot of critics of the George W. Bush administration. Again, we don't get political. No matter what you think of George W. Bush, there were people attacking him on the grounds that this was violative of the Constitution. I don't think so. Foreigners do not have constitutional rights. Certainly not in time of war. Now, if you're talking about something like the Civil War, where the entire theory of just war by the North was that, well, these people can't actually secede because they are Americans, well, then necessarily the Constitution has to apply. They have to have constitutional rights, or your entire just war cause is it's hypocritical. In this case, these are not American citizens. They don't have constitutional rights. You can't point to one of the amendments to the Constitution and say, well, this is being violated. It doesn't apply to them. No matter what you think of George W. Bush or anything, obviously I have a slanted view of Guantanamo's detention of these guys and not letting them go to trial for 20 years, but it has nothing to do with the Constitution. It has to do with just plain interests of justice. You can't hold a man in a jail without a trial for 20 years. Whether they're an American citizen or not, it is simply unjust. So that's one of the biggest issues. That's what this article's about. And quite honestly, that's why a lot of people voted for Obama, including yours truly, by the way, at least the first time. I would spend the next 2 decades, again, this is Miss Williams speaking, I would spend the next 2 decades learning those prisoners' names and covering the story of America's not-so-secret terrorism detention complex. It started as a research challenge to uncover the secrets of what some have called the American Gulag. Later, as hundreds more nameless enemy combatants were brought to the remote U.S. naval base on the south coast of Cuba, I followed the story through the brief wax and long wane of the Guantanamo news cycle. I wanted to know who was detained and why, and when the war on terror would end. Well, there's your problem right there. The war on terror will never end. And in fact, you could even question, when did it begin? I remember being in, well, first of all, I remember 9/11. And I remember that this was ostensibly the beginning of the war on terror, right? But this is what happens when you allow people to rewrite history. That is no longer the beginning of the war on terror, necessarily. I remember going to California and seeing a memorial saying that the war on terror actually started in 1973, not 2001. So you can not only say, well, this is the enemy. No, that was always the enemy, just like 1984. Like, who are we even fighting now was always the question. I don't remember who we were supposed to be fighting, but I know that we've been at war with them forever. You can pull that trick. You can extend it endlessly. It's an endless war against just terror. Terror, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or now the United States. But you can also say, well, this didn't really begin in 2001, did it? It began years earlier. It began in 1973. That's when it really opened. And if you look back further in history, it really began when Germany started violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact and all of these international law treaties to which they were or were not a part, committing war crimes which did or did not exist in international legislation at the time. Yeah, you could just keep going back. So you can extend this war endlessly against any enemy and claim you've been at war with them forever, since 2001, since 1973, since 1914. It doesn't matter. That is the nature of this game. She continues, I collected boxes of files and spreadsheets of data, building a trove of Guantanamo research as I moved to new jobs in new cities. Along the way, I encountered other reporters and researchers with similar habits and disparate methods, all seeking to understand what was going on down there. Some 780 Muslim men have been held at Guantanamo since 2002. More than 500 were released during the Bush administration, about 200 under President Barack Obama, 1 by President Donald Trump, and 1 so far by President Joe Biden. Many have been repatriated, while others have been transferred to countries that negotiated with the U.S. to accept them. 9 died in custody. 39 remain at Guantanamo today. Of those, 18 have been approved for transfer to other countries, including 5 approved by the Biden administration on Tuesday. So not only do you get held in Guantanamo for 20 years with no trial whatsoever, you then get released not to go home, but to go to another country. Who knows what kind of laws or rules they have. They're released to, it doesn't matter, that they're not the United States, right? So they presumably do not have the same legal protections that we are supposed to have, whether for citizens or non-citizens. Really, again, it's not about the Constitution. It is about justice. It is about natural law. What is right and wrong? Is it right to hold a man in prison for 20 years with no trial? It's so obviously wrong that a child would understand that any attorney should understand that. And yet, here we are. Not to downplay 9/11, not to say that there were never attacks on U.S. citizens or U.S. soldiers, not to say that there was no terrorism. It's to say that assuming there was terrorism and assuming these people are responsible for it, which I'm not debating at all, you should bring them to trial. If you're going to take this road where it's not an act of war, which was the Obama administration's entire theory, this is not an act of war. These people are simply criminals. We should try them in civil courts, not by military tribunals. We should try them in civil courts because it's a police action. We're not going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. This isn't war. These people are not warriors. We're not in a legitimate combat situation with these people. They are criminals, and we are the police, and we need to try them in court. That was the entire legal theory. And yet they never actually put them on trial. It's a double wrong. Double plus negative, comrades. In 2004, the Post appended Miss Williams, the Post appended my list of detainees and added my name to the page 1 byline of a story headlined, Guantanamo, a holding cell in war on terror. Well, we all know how that turns out. So then she begins to discuss the Guantanamo docket, the FOIA requests that a bunch of people did, the CIA's black sites, which are famous by now. I mean, this stuff is just not even debatable. This has been uncovered over 20 years. The U.S. government did these things. There's no question about it. And still, no trials. She has the Obama years under here. She then talks about the Trump era. Again, Trump released 1 of these guys. Still no trials. And she ends thusly. I signed up for this. I'm sorry. Let's go back 1 paragraph. The Biden administration could take some relatively simple steps to increase transparency around Guantanamo. To begin with, it could declassify the 6,000-page Senate torture report. A second courtroom now being built at Guantanamo for $4 million could have facilities for press to observe the proceedings in person, which are not in the current plans. Let's talk about just those simple things. First of all, increasing transparency around Guantanamo. You have to make a decision, right? Are these people enemy combatants? Are we at war with them? Are they deserving of the rights of someone who committed an act of war against an enemy? Or are they criminals subject to a police action who should be tried in civil court? You can't eat your cake and have it too. Either Guantanamo is a military institution with military tribunals, and they are enemies, combatants, tried by military tribunal, in which case there should be no transparency, right? Or are they simply criminals that we have to prosecute in civil courts, in which case there certainly should be transparency and they shouldn't be in Guantanamo. The government and media have had it both ways for far too long. I wish I could remember the name of it. There was a documentary on the media's complicity in what the George W. Bush administration did concerning the Iraq invasion and Guantanamo Bay. The media would just straight publish whatever the Bush administration gave them. That was pretty well documented. And you would think that they'd figure out by now you can't do that, but they still work hand in glove with the government, depending on which faction of the government we're talking about. Let's talk about the third sentence in this paragraph. A second courtroom now being built at Guantanamo for $4 million could have facilities for press to observe the proceedings in person, which are not in the current plans. Now, I don't know about that courtroom. I have admittedly not been to Guantanamo Bay as a lawyer or otherwise. So all I know is what is quoted here. The New York Times has published an article, Pentagon Building New Secret Courtroom at Guantanamo Bay. Subtitle, the concept is to permit 2 military judges to hold proceedings simultaneously starting in mid-2023. So this is where Miss Williams now gets to the line that she is going to, the projected delivery date is in 2023, and this is when the trials of the Guantanamo detainees are going to start, right? What's interesting is her saying that, well, there's no plans for having the press be there in person for these trials. It brings to mind the Nuremberg trials, which opens up a whole different can of worms here. The Nuremberg trials, no matter whether your ancestors fought for one side or the other, the Nuremberg trials were 100% a show trial. The courtroom was specifically built and designed to film it. The quote-unquote videos that were showed during the trial, they were made by a Hollywood crew. A lot of people don't know that, just like they don't know that the courthouse was specifically designed to film it as a theatrical production. And for those who don't know anything about what I'm talking about, the Nuremberg trials were the massive trials of the SS officers at the conclusion of World War II, right? So they set this whole thing up to make a show of the fact that we are prosecuting these people, these SS officers, for their war crimes. Not doing the same thing in Guantanamo is interesting. They are apparently not building it so that it can be televised and broadcast to everyone. Look at what these people did, showcasing this moral high horse that the U.S. could stand on. They're not doing that. And the press is lamenting that. They want to be there. So again, is it a public show trial where there should be transparency? It's a civil action against criminals, and we're always in the right. Or is it a military tribunal trying enemy combatants in which there should not be press? She continues, and it could speed up the Freedom of Information Act process. My 2017 request for State Department documents relating to the detainee transfer process is still open, with a projected delivery date in 2023. Oh, I'm sorry. That was a totally different 2023 date. New York Times is asking me to subscribe in order to read this article about the courtroom. I'm not going to do that. I'm absolutely not going to pay the New York Times for anything ever. Although, if any of you are graphic designers who could make a banner for me that says like as seen on, New York Times, GQ, Daily Beast, all that would be super swell of you. I'll be quite honest, I have no idea if the audio is broadcasting, if there's a chat today. I don't know what's going on here because the bloody computer is just not working. The Intercept says, wait, before you go on about your day, ask yourself, how likely is it that the story you just read would have been produced by a different news outlet if the Intercept hadn't done it? And then a fundraising plea. Well, it's unlikely that anyone would do it. New York Times might do it, but I'm sure it wouldn't have the same slant. However, with Greenwald gone, I'm just not donating. And I'm not paying for the New York Times, so thank you, but no thank you. Let's talk about the relation of what is going on in Guantanamo to what we have to deal with as American citizens. No matter how you feel about 9/11, the Iraq War, hold on, Tucker, I'm not done yet. No matter what you think about 9/11, the Iraq War, whether we were justified in going in or not, whether Bush should be tried for war crimes or Trump or Obama or Biden, all of that aside, you have to recognize that there is a serious, a grave, a biblical injustice in keeping men in prison for 20 years without a trial. It's just, you can't even say medieval. It's just plain evil. That was not a pun on words, no pun intended there. Point being, things like this come back to haunt you. The things that we do as a country, they always come back. Just like they did to Rome, just like they did the British Empire. And when we hold people in prison for 20 years without a trial and we are engaged in that level of injustice, it will come back to us. We've talked on this program before about Matt Hale's case, about how the Patriot Act was passed with all of us being told, well, this is for those evil overseas Muslims that are attacking America. We have to pass the Patriot Act and give the FBI this unprecedented power. We have to allow them to check out our library logs, our computer access, all these things. We have to allow them sneak and peek into our home. We have to double sentences for accused terrorists, prison sentences, that is. We got sold that whole line because look at what these people over there are trying to do to our freedoms. The freedom ain't free, We got to pass this legislation, give the government unprecedented power. And what do? They turn around and say, these people are domestic terrorists. We have to use this against them. 20 years later, we are now finally coming to understand, as I've been saying for years, that this was never about foreign people attacking us on 9/11. This was always about expanding government control and government power. Think of that in context of this June 2021 fact sheet published by the White House that Tucker Carlson is about to introduce to us. Let's hope that this works on this audio broadcast, for which I have no feedback.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight there was a lot going on right around the time of the last presidential inauguration, so you may have missed that on his very first day as president, Joe Biden ordered federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies to prepare a review of how the administration should fight terrorism. By last June, that report was complete. It concluded that after more than 20 years, Islamic terror is no longer the greatest threat to this country. Instead, the agencies declared that domestic political extremism is, quote, the most urgent terrorism threat the United States faces today.
All right, let's talk about that. I said this in October of 2015, I think it was, when the DOJ official was quoted as saying that ISIS is not the greatest threat we face. And this is a month before the the Bataclan attacks in Paris, right? When ISIS just leveled everybody in Paris, and then they were just attack after attack after attack. At that time, the DOJ was saying, that's not the biggest problem. We don't have an ISIS problem. ISIS is not a threat to the United States. You know what a threat to the United States is? The biggest threat to the United States? It's patriot groups, veterans, and people with anti-government political ideologies. That's the biggest threat here. They were saying that back then. The Department of Justice, totally apolitical body of lawyers, by the way. They have no political interests at all, just like we don't on crime and punishment. They were saying that back in 2015, and no one was paying attention. Everyone just thought, oh, well, how could he say that? Or, oh, well, interesting. I didn't know that was a bigger threat. Whatever their reaction, it was not, hold on, something is terribly wrong here. Now, fast forward to June of 2021, which was what, 6 years later? Not even 6 years later. The Biden administration is now in power. As a matter of fact, it was the Obama administration that was in power when the DOJ first started saying this. This report from the White House, published last June, the one Tucker is talking about here, states, quote, the review was rooted in an expert assessment of the domestic terrorism threat. There's no hyperlink to that. What expert are they talking about, or which experts? But rest assured, it was an expert assessment of the domestic terrorism threat provided by the intelligence and law enforcement communities. Well, that's who did the expert assessment. The intelligence and law enforcement communities, who, of course, have absolutely no axe to grind and have no undue influence from groups like the ADL or the SPLC. An unclassified summary of that assessment was released in March, that is 2021, so the public could see the key findings. It found that the two most lethal elements of today's domestic terrorism threat are 1, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race, and 2, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists such as militia violent extremists. Note how they specifically disclaim it's not anti-government, communist, anarchist, Antifa, or Black Lives Matter. It is anti-government militia violent extremists. Either way you cut it, it's either you are a racist advocating for superiority of the white race, or you are an anti-government conservative who's part of a militia. You are the greatest threat of domestic terrorism in the United States. Now, all of that to say, look at what has happened in Guantanamo. Again, for the past 20 years, left and right have been sounding the alarm. This is very bad, and no one cares. When the Obama administration orders a drone strike on an American citizen, the right wing says, well, he was a terrorist. You know, what are we supposed to give him a trial? They think it's a laughing matter until it comes home to roost, that chicken, right? Until there's a drone strike on American soil against really anybody, but let's say it's a non-citizen. Is that going to be the frog in the frying pan? You turn it up just a little bit and the frog's like, well, yeah, okay, it was on American soil, but no Americans died. It was a non-citizen. He was a terrorist after all, so whatever. Or what if it's a drone strike on an American citizen who is overseas and is not a Muslim this time, who's a white nationalist, or an accused white nationalist, a Trump supporter? What do you say then? Who gets up in arms then? Or if there's a drone strike here on American soil against an American citizen, what do they have to say to justify it? He was a racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist who advocated for the superiority of the white race, or he was an anti-government or anti-authority violent extremist who was, by the way, a member of the militia. Those people don't need trials, right? Like the people in Guantanamo. What if it's not a drone strike? They don't kill the guy. They kidnap him, arrest him, extradite him to, maybe it's not Guantanamo, maybe it's some other place. Who knows? Maybe they put him in a county jail in South Carolina or California or Oklahoma. Maybe they put him in a federal holding cell. Whatever the case, they hold him there for 20 years. And they don't give him a trial. Then what? Is he an enemy combatant? Is he entitled to constitutional rights, or has he forfeited them by being accused of being an enemy combatant? That has been the whole debate for the past 20 years, and nobody has been paying attention to the real question. They've been paying attention to, well, but, I mean, wasn't the guy a terrorist, though? Well, wasn't he a foreigner? I mean, the Constitution doesn't really apply, right? Which I would say, if that really were the argument, but it's not. The argument isn't, does the Constitution apply? The argument isn't, well, is he a foreigner? Is he a Muslim? Is he Israeli? Is he American? That has never been the issue. The issue is, can you order a drone strike on someone just on the mere accusation this guy's a terrorist? Can you arrest that guy and put him in a holding cell for 20 years without a trial because you have accused him of being a terrorist or of being an advocate for the superiority of the white race? I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. That really should bother you. 20 years ago, if you were on the right wing, it should have bothered you that, well, we can just arrest anyone we want, put him in Guantanamo Bay indefinitely without a trial, say whatever we want about them, force feed them when they go on hunger strikes. That should have bothered you, even though it was about Muslims accused of terrorism. Present day, it should bother you if you are a liberal or anywhere left of center, including the far left, if all the government has to do is say, well, he is, after all, an advocate for the superiority of the white race. I mean, is he even human? This has been going on since before 1914, and Carl Schmitt pointed this out in the concept of the political when he was pointing out the hypocrisies of international law. One of the greatest of which is, well, if they don't sign on to this liberal international order, are they really even human? If you don't believe in democracy and in our international liberal order, you're part of the barbaric past. We have to bomb you into modernity. It doesn't matter if we bomb civilians, if we firebomb Dresden, deliberately kill women and children, if we bomb residential neighborhoods to demoralize the public and stop them from supporting the government. None of that matters because they didn't sign on to the program. It's been going on for over 100 years. You either side with this order or you don't really have rights to speak of because you are a monster. It should bother you. Let's listen to what Tucker has to say about it because he's far more eloquent than me and he's got some other things to talk about.
That's a very stark assessment. So you have to ask, who exactly are these terrorists who threaten us so urgently? And they're not who you might expect. The report did not even mention the BLM riots, the deadly...
By the way, I consider this fair use because we are commenting on Tucker. We're not just airing it without permission. We're commenting on what he's doing and going back to the fact sheet published by the Biden administration. So please don't sue us, Fox News.
BLM riots that had just taken place. There wasn't a word about Antifa. There was nothing about the gunmen who murdered 800 Americans in the city of Chicago last year, many of them children. No, they weren't there. Instead, the Biden administration declared that the, quote, most lethal elements of today's domestic terror threat are political conservatives. They're people who disagree with Joe Biden. Now, that report was released almost exactly 6 months ago this Friday. It received relatively little attention and hasn't since. And no major news organization even asked the most obvious question. These terrorists who threaten us, where are they? If Trump voters are really the most, quote, lethal threat that our country faces today, where are all the people they've killed? That's not an easy question to answer. Just look at the numbers, which are fairly tidily kept. Take a look at all the Americans who died by violence over the past 12 months, and there are many thousands and thousands of Americans, and ask a simple question. How many of them were killed by right-wingers for political reasons? Not many. Or since we're talking about threats here, pose the question another way. Are you more in danger walking through a neighborhood that votes 90% Democrat or a neighborhood that votes 90% Republican? Come on. This claim is ridiculous. On its face, there is no substantial right-wing terror threat in this country, certainly not in relative terms. There just isn't. And no one's shown there is. The White House knows this, of course. They can read the numbers as well as anyone else can. So they're working hard to create the illusion of that threat. Much hangs on their ability to do that. You may remember the story this fall about a group called the National School Boards Association, which sent a letter to the feds asking the DOJ to take a look at parents who don't like their kids' curriculums. Well, the Justice Department responded immediately to that letter. Talk about customer service. Days later, the Attorney General announced the FBI would investigate moms who dared to complain at school board meetings as potential terrorists. Many people were shocked by this story, but we just learned it's worse even than we thought it was. A new Freedom of Information Act request has revealed that the National School Boards Association asked the feds to investigate parents because the feds asked them to ask the feds to investigate parents. See how that works? Apparently, the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, told school board administrators to write their letter to the White House. The White House then used that letter as a pretext to begin a crackdown on parents. See how that works? The snake eating its tail. When you don't have enough domestic terrorists to justify a political purge, then you just go ahead and create them. And that's exactly what they've been doing. This week, the campaign against this new American al-Qaeda entered a new and very ominous phase. Again, little noticed by the national media. This Tuesday, 2 days ago, the DOJ announced the creation of a new domestic terrorism unit. What will it do? Well, it will target, quote, anti-authority ideologues. Anti-authority ideologues. Now, keep in mind, this country was founded by people who are anti-authority ideologues. That's why they created America and baked the idea of opposing authority, so it doesn't get too big and take over your life, into our founding documents. These ideas are central to the American idea. In fact, they are the American idea. But in this administration, they are now crimes. Here's Matt Olson, the Assistant Attorney General, explaining.
We face an elevated threat from domestic violent extremists. That is, individuals in the United States who seek to commit violent criminal acts in furtherance of domestic, social, or political goals. Domestic violent extremists are often motivated by a mix of ideologies and personal grievances. We've seen a growing threat from those who are motivated by racial animus, as well as those who ascribe to extremist, anti-government, and anti-authority ideologies. I've decided to establish a domestic terrorism unit to augment our existing approach. This group of dedicated attorneys will focus on the domestic terrorism threat.
Who's the threat to the country? That guy is the threat to the country, and the people working for him and those propping him up, and the people spreading the core lie here, which is that American citizens who distrust the government or don't like its policies are terrorists. Just today on MSNBC, Jason Johnson, one of its contributors, described the entire Republican Party as a terrorist organization.
By the way, when he says just today, this was January 13th. I was out last week, not in Florida, for litigation training. So we were not able to broadcast this when I'd like to have, but keep in mind, this is not today's news. This is, we're getting a little old news here, but still very relevant. And I really want to talk about the part where he brings in the Roger Stone prosecution. I think that's of primary importance here. So let's continue listening.
So you can see where this is going. Again, and we're quoting now, this is the Assistant Attorney General, we have seen a growing threat from those who subscribe to anti-government and anti-authority ideologies. Really, is that threat growing? Is it true? Let's see here. That threat is being used to justify the creation of this agency, but it's not rooted in reality. 27 years ago, back in 1995, you'll remember, 168 people were murdered in the Oklahoma City bombing. Another 700 were injured. Now, the investigation into what happened that day involved nearly 30,000 interviews. Investigators gathered 7,000 pounds of evidence. We could go on. It was an enormous investigation. Attorney General Merrick Garland, by the way, was part of it at the time. Here's the point. Despite the size of that investigation, no one suggested, even hinted, that we might need to create a new domestic terror division within the DOJ to handle the problem. No. The whole thing was handled by FBI field offices, as things like this had been for many decades. The FBI field offices did their jobs. The man accused of doing it got the death penalty, and you may have noticed it didn't happen again. And then Joe Biden became president, and the number of so-called domestic terror investigations more than doubled.
Right. So let's talk about that. We've talked about that previously on the show. This whole thing with statistics, well, it more than doubled. I think we talked about that specific statistic the other day, last broadcast. Just like the difference between dying of old age and dying of natural causes. And no one dies of old age anymore. Like, how did that happen? Are they all getting heart attacks? Well, it's because everybody dies of natural causes now. All you have to do is change the terminology. Just like the dramatic rise in hate crimes. How did that happen? Like, everybody now is magically so full of hate. Post-Trump, everybody has turned into a racist and a hate monger and is just beating everybody in sight. No, it's because they've made everything a hate crime. They have changed the legislation. They have changed the labels of these crimes. And so, necessarily, the statistics change. Likewise, a keen observer will note that we're not getting double the domestic terrorism in this country. We're getting double the domestic terrorism investigations, which means the Biden administration is sicking these people on double the people now. It doesn't mean that's double the people actually committing crimes. And if you've been paying attention for the last several years, a lot of the times the FBI goes after these people, it's the FBI creating the plots themselves. They formulate the plots. They provide the materials for bomb making. They are half the crew when you kidnap a governor in Michigan. They are behind all these things. So doubling the amount of investigations into domestic terrorism in this country does not mean that there's double the domestic terrorism. It means that they are stepping up their own involvement in domestic terrorism planning. It's insane. The 1984 meme is just, it's like Poe's Law, like, well, you can't tell whether anything's satire anymore. At this point, it's like, well, 1984 is so common that it's not even worth mentioning anymore. This is just, it's like somebody in there, in the club that George Carlin talked about, somebody in there got this book and said, hey, this is an excellent idea. We should restrict people from saying all these words. Let's just get rid of all these words, dumb people down in their speech. You're not allowed to say X, Y, Z, things I can't even say on a podcast anymore without getting banned from YouTube. You can't say these words. Now you have to say double plus good, comrade. Likewise, just this, we're doubling the investigations. That is double speak. It's, you're not doubling, the domestic terrorism has not doubled as a problem. The setups have doubled. The quote-unquote investigations have doubled. Completely different than what the government is spinning on this.
So the question is, what exactly are they investigating? If there's no substantial death toll from these terrorists in our midst, what exactly are the feds looking into? Well, they're taking a close look at crimes like the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a plot that helped her political fortunes considerably. What did it consist of? Well, that conspiracy, in the end, turned out to have more FBI agents and informants involved than would-be kidnappers. The guy the Fed said were running it turned out to be homeless. He was living in the basement of a vacuum repair shop. His friends called him Captain Autism, and they called him that for a reason. He wasn't the ringleader of anything. He couldn't have been. The whole thing was ridiculous. But it stoked the storyline that was politically expedient, and so the media uncritically promoted it again and again, as if it were real. The media's job, by the way, to remind you, is to push back against government statements to find out if they're actually true. Because it turns out politicians may say things for political reasons.
No.
And it's the media's job to discern truth from spin. The media's job is not to act as spokesmen for the people in power. And yet that's what they're doing. Now the DOJ, in case you haven't noticed, has decided that the January 6th protesters are the real terrorists. They're the insurrectionists you keep hearing about. And yet, weirdly, as of just 2 days ago, not one American citizen had actually been charged by the federal government with insurrecting. Watch them admit that.
Has anyone been charged with the crime of insurrection following January 6th?
I am not aware that anyone has been charged with that particular offense, even if it is an offense. I just am not aware of that.
Oops. They can't actually be insurrectionists if no one has committed insurrection. That's pretty embarrassing. Apparently, the DOJ finally realized how embarrassing it was. So about 48 hours after the testimony you just saw, and more than a year after January 6th, today the feds announced that they will charge someone with sedition after all. Now, if you've got any questions about the timing of these charges or the merit of the sedition case the DOJ just announced, the Biden administration would like to remind you to keep those questions to yourself. And just to make certain you do keep them to yourself or unable to share them with anyone else, today Joe Biden also announced a crackdown on the news media. As he put it, a crackdown on anyone who spreads, quote, disinformation and misinformation about his government. Watch.
If you haven't gotten vaccinated, do it. Personal choice impacts us all, our hospitals, our countries. I make a special appeal to social media companies and media outlets. Please deal with the misinformation and disinformation that's on your shows. It has to stop.
The misinformation that's on your shows. Yeah. Message received. It has to stop, Joe Biden says. So that means that big tech and media organizations have to do what he says, just like his vax mandate, found unconstitutional today, by the way. It'll still be enforced because big businesses rely on the government to exist. They take government money. They are regulated from the very top to the very bottom by the government. So it takes a lot to defy the President of the United States. If he tells you to do something, you'd better do it. What Joe Biden is telling media companies to do today is to censor their content so it doesn't contradict his decrees. Now, see,
Which reminds me, I meant to talk about this earlier. You might have seen it on Twitter. China, when playing Fight Club on television, they changed the ending so that the final scene, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Fight Club, turn off this broadcast because the ending is fire. They changed the ending so that instead of all the buildings blowing up and collapsing, there's a black screen that says something to the effect of the police were able to catch all of the suspects and avert the bombing, and everyone lived happily ever after because all the terrorists were arrested, right? People are flipping out about this terrible instance of communist censorship in China. How could they? What's amazing is this is exactly what happened in American History X. And what's poetic justice about it is that it was Edward Norton himself who did it. So American History X, if you haven't seen it, has the same main actor as Fight Club, Edward Norton, both cases. Now, the director of American History X was out of town on some kind of vacation or something for like the final weeks of production, and he left Edward Norton in charge of it. American History X ends, again, spoiler alert, turn off the program if you haven't seen American History X and Fight Club. American History X ends with Derek's little brother being shot by a black kid. We make no judgments about that. We no political views here. Shot by a black kid. And Derek is holding him, crying. He's covered in blood. It's a horrible scene. Meanwhile, his little brother's essay on the better angels of our nature is playing in the background, and we have to love each other, so on and so forth. This is how it ends. It is an ending that makes absolutely no sense. It is a horrible ending. No matter what you feel about skinheads and all the rest, it is just a bad ending to a movie. Well, you might be surprised to know that isn't actually the end of the movie. The movie actually ends with Derek looking into the mirror and shaving his head again. It was supposed to be symbolic of the cyclical nature of violence and how we cannot escape violence. Whether in America or anywhere else, it's human nature that we keep getting involved in this cycle of violence, right? So Derek becomes a skinhead again, and he goes back into that war scene. Edward Norton cut that out. You might have some notion that this is different because, well, it's capitalism, and he made that decision as an individual. It wasn't the government doing it. Like, what's the difference? There is an elite who is saying, no, that can't be the ending. That is not the message that we want to portray to the public. Edward Norton, Ivy League educated Hollywood actor, he said, no, that can't be how this ends. God forbid these skinheads see this and think, yeah, exactly, Likewise, in China, God forbid people see the end of Fight Club and say, what a great idea, we should blow up credit card companies. Or whatever the Chinese government didn't want them to think. I don't know what... You would think that communists would want people to blow up credit card companies. I don't know. I don't know what's in the mind of Chinese government officials. I do know that this hysteria about Chinese censorship, Chinese cracking down on Hong Kong independence, Chinese doing this and that, every single time you see them attacking the Chinese for this egregious censorship and political crackdowns, it has already been done in America 100 times over. Incredible. Anyway, Chase says the ending justified Derek's views. Right. Well, I guess that was why it had to be censored, because the ending, if it ended in Derek going back to the skinheads, it would have justified the skinheads. And so, Edward Norton would necessarily think, well, we can't have that. Wouldn't that ending be fundamentally anti-racist, perhaps, though, the real ending? Would it be? I would think Chase is right, that would justify the racists, wouldn't it? I don't know. All I'm saying is this hysteria about China censoring everybody is just plain misplaced, because we have done the same thing 100 million times over.
CNN has no problem with this. In fact, they made fun of what Joe Biden said today. They made fun of his call for censorship, not because it's obviously unconstitutional, which it is, but because it wasn't quite fascist enough. One of those weird-looking media reporters over at CNN wrote this, quote, "I'm sure the Murdochs will get right on this now that this special appeal has been made, exclamation point." So they understand exactly what's going on here. Joe Biden is targeting Fox News for censorship. His call for censorship, by the way, comes after hundreds of doctors and scientists called on Spotify to adopt a misinformation policy that would shut down Joe Rogan's podcast. Rogan recovered from COVID without the vax, and they hate him for it. So it's not just the government, of course, it's people acting on behalf of the government calling for the same thing, which is censorship of political opinions. What you're seeing here is dangerous. There's no other way to describe it. Far more dangerous than domestic terror threat they've been bloviating about for the last 3 days. It contravenes the First Amendment. Under the First Amendment, the government cannot coordinate with private actors to censor free speech, period.
Bloviating is a word we just don't use enough, by the way.
The Supreme Court has made that very clear over centuries. And yet that's exactly what's happening. Joe Biden did it today. Care to complain about that? Probably not. You may have noticed what happens to people who complain too much. Roger Stone, for example, complained an awful lot about the government. He did it loudly, often. He did it for years. And the DOJ didn't like it. So in the end, they accused Roger Stone on the basis of zero evidence whatsoever of colluding with Russia.
Now, this is the part I really want to talk today. Usually I would have shut this down 5 to 10 minutes ago because we have to end at 1600, but we've got to talk about this thing about Roger Stone. Because what Tucker is saying is 100% on point. This is the entire reason for the video, which only has like a minute and a half left, but this is the important part.
In the end, they charged him with lying to Congress, something that happens literally every day of the year. But in his case, they made it a felony, threatened to send him to prison for the rest of his life. But in the meantime, they sent a helicopter, a boat, and armed paramilitaries to his home at dawn after coordinating the raid with CNN. Really one of the darkest moments in civil liberties in recent history. We still have the tape. Let's watch it again.
Exclusive footage you're looking at right now from CNN as the FBI arrives at Roger Stone's residence in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, taking him into custody. They arrived before dawn.
Now, what you see in the video, it's got Fox News logo at the left, bottom left, and it's got an end screen of CNN's broadcast with the CNN logo on it from when this was live. Because, as he said, the FBI coordinated with CNN to pull off this stunt. Super extra dirty. January 2019, so that was 3 years ago now. Man, it seems like it was just yesterday. But the headline is FBI arrests Roger Stone, and you've got all these personnel in military gear. They're all FBI agents in, battle dress with bulletproof vests, rifles, headphones, the whole 9 yards, right? And it's just this striking visual of a military raid on Roger Stone at dawn.
On there before 6 a.m. or just after 6 a.m., a dozen officers were told.
So they coordinate with CNN just to make sure it's all preserved on tape to send the message to everybody else for the encouragement of the others, as the French used to say. And then they send guys with automatic weapons to your house to shut you up, to destroy you. Now, the people who ordered that raid should have been brought up on charges themselves, but they weren't. They're promoted. And now, thanks to Joe Biden, they have more power to harass their political enemies. Do you feel safer?
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here.
No, you don't get an ad here, Sean. Anyway, excellent point. There is a, I think, pretty good chance that people here in Florida are correct. This is not coming from me. I'm just reporting what was reported to me, which is every reporter's cop-out, right? It was reported to me that the rumor on the grapevine was it was Roger Stone who orchestrated this goat sacrifice thing against me, trying to end me and end my political career. Back in, 2015? Yeah, 2015. I have every reason to hate Roger Stone. If it's true that he was the one who was responsible for doing that to me. But that is besides the point. Anyone, including me, who sees the FBI coordinating with CNN to pull a stunt like this should be supremely concerned. Because one day it's not going to be a libertarian or a Trump supporter or whichever group you don't like that this guy's a part of, a Nixon supporter, an old white man, a neocon or whatever he is, paleocon, I don't know. Whatever you don't like about Roger Stone, one day it's going to be you. Just like the guys in Guantanamo Bay. You might not like them for being Muslim. You might not like them for their roles in Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11, but to hold them for 20 years without a trial, sooner or later, it's coming back on you. Goodbye.